On a rain-soaked Portland night, a widowed father's simple act of kindness toward a broken soldier would shatter everything he thought he knew about love loss and second chances. When Daniel Hayes saw something in that stranger's eyes that mirrored his own pain, he made a decision that would either heal 3 wounded souls or destroy them all. This is their story of finding family in the most unexpected places. The rain hammered Portland's streets like bullets from heaven, each drop exploding against the asphalt in a symphony of sorrow that seemed to echo the rhythm of Daniel Hayes's broken heart. He gripped the steering wheel of his weathered Honda Civic knuckles white against the black leather, while his 8-year-old daughter Lily pressed her face against the passenger window, watching the world blur past in streaks of amber streetlight and shadow. "Daddy, why does the rain sound angry tonight?" Lily's voice carried that particular brand of innocence that could still stop Daniel's breath, even 3 years after losing his wife Rachel to cancer. Daniel glanced at his daughter through the rearview mirror, her dark curls so much like her mother's catching the intermittent glow of passing headlights. "Sometimes the sky just needs to cry, sweetheart, just like people do." It was past 9 o'clock on a Tuesday in November, and they were driving home from Lily's piano lesson. Mrs. Chen had kept them late working on a piece that Rachel had once hummed while gardening Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The irony wasn't lost on Daniel that his daughter was learning to play the song that had been the soundtrack to his happiest memories, now twisted into something that felt more like a funeral dirge. The bus stop on Morrison Street appeared through the rain like a ghost from another world. Daniel had passed this same corner hundreds of times over the years, usually without a second glance. But tonight, something made him slow down. Maybe it was the way the lone figure sat perfectly straight on the metal bench despite the rain soaking through what appeared to be military fatigues. Maybe it was the fact that no bus had run this route after 8 p.m. since the city cut funding 2 years ago. Or maybe it was the way the woman's posture, rigid as a steel beam, yet somehow conveying the weight of carrying an invisible burden, reminded him of how he'd sat in the hospital waiting room the night Rachel died, holding himself together through sheer force of will, while everything inside him shattered like glass. "Daddy, stop the car!" Lily's voice cut through his thoughts with startling clarity. "What?" Daniel's foot instinctively moved toward the brake. "That soldier lady. She's getting all wet and there's no bus coming. Mommy always said we should help people when they need it." Daniel's heart clenched. Rachel had indeed taught their daughter that lesson, usually while pressing sandwiches into the hands of homeless veterans downtown or donating clothes to the women's shelter. His wife had possessed an almost supernatural ability to spot broken souls and offer them exactly what they needed to heal. He pulled over before he could talk himself out of it, the Honda's tires splashing through a puddle that sent water cascading across the sidewalk. Through the passenger window, he could see the woman more clearly now. She couldn't have been more than 30, with close-cropped auburn hair that was plastered to her skull by the rain. Her digital camouflage uniform bore the name tape, Donovan, and Sergeant Stripes that had seen better days. But it was her eyes that made Daniel's chest tight, empty, hollow, like someone had scooped out everything vital and left only the shell behind. He knew that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror for months after Rachel's funeral. Daniel rolled down the passenger window, rain immediately beginning to pepper the interior of the car. "Excuse me," he called out, having to raise his voice over the storm. "Are you waiting for the bus?" The woman, Sergeant Donovan, according to her uniform, turned toward him with the mechanical precision of someone accustomed to following orders. Up close, Daniel could see the faint scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, and the way her hands trembled slightly despite being clenched into fists on her lap. "Yes, sir." Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in days. "Though I'm beginning to think it's not coming." "It's not," Daniel said, surprised by his own boldness. "Route was discontinued. Where are you trying to get to?" For a moment, something flickered across her face. Confusion, maybe fear. She started to speak, then stopped, looking down at her hands as if they might provide the answer. "I'm not entirely sure, to be honest." Lily leaned forward from the back seat, her small face appearing in the window opening. "Are you a real soldier, like the ones Mommy used to send care packages to?" The woman's expression softened marginally as she looked at Lily. "I was." Recently discharged. What's discharged mean? Lily asked with the relentless curiosity of childhood. It means her job as a soldier is finished. Daniel explained gently, though something in the woman's posture suggested the ending hadn't been entirely voluntary. He made a decision that would have terrified the careful, cautious man he'd become since Rachel's death. Look, you're soaked to the bone, and it's only getting worse out here. Why don't you come with us? We can give you a ride, maybe a hot meal, and a place to dry off. The words hung in the rain-soaked air between them, and Daniel immediately began second-guessing himself. What was he doing inviting a complete stranger into his car, into his life? He had Lily to think about responsibilities, caution that had kept them safe in their carefully constructed bubble of routine and predictability. But something in the woman's eyes, a flicker of gratitude mixed with desperate hope, reminded him so strongly of Rachel that his resolve strengthened. His wife would have done exactly the same thing, probably would have brought the woman home and spent the entire night making sure she was fed warm and felt human again. I don't want to impose, Sergeant Donovan said quietly, but Daniel could hear the longing in her voice, the need for human connection that she was trying to keep buried beneath military discipline. You're not imposing, Lily chirped before Daniel could respond. Daddy makes really good grilled cheese, and we have extra blankets. Mommy always said our house was big enough for anyone who needed somewhere safe to be. Daniel felt his throat tighten at his daughter's words. So much of Rachel's spirit lived on in this beautiful, empathetic little girl. She's right, he managed. There's no obligation beyond getting out of this rain and maybe sharing a meal. What do you say? For a long moment, Sergeant Donovan studied them both through the rain-streaked window. Daniel could see her weighing options, calculating risks, probably running through a dozen reasons why accepting help from strangers was a bad idea. But exhaustion and something deeper, a bone-deep weariness that went far beyond physical tiredness, finally won out. Okay, she said quietly, standing from the bench with the careful movements of someone whose body had been through trauma. Thank you. As she walked around to the rear passenger door, Daniel caught a glimpse of her profile in the headlights and felt his breath catch. There was something heartbreakingly beautiful about her, even bedraggled and rain-soaked as she was. It wasn't just her delicate features or the way her wet uniform clung to her slender frame. It was the vulnerability she was trying so hard to hide beneath her military bearing, the glimpse of the woman she might have been before whatever had happened to put those shadows in her eyes. She slid into the back seat next to Lily, bringing with her the scent of rain and something else, gun oil maybe, or the particular smell of canvas and metal that seemed to cling to soldiers even after they'd left the service behind. I'm Lily, his daughter announced, immediately extending her small hand with the fearless friendliness that came naturally to children. And that's my daddy, Daniel. What's your name? Claire, the woman replied, shaking Lily's hand with surprising gentleness. Claire Donovan. Are you from Portland? Claire, Daniel asked as he pulled back into traffic, adjusting the rear-view mirror so he could keep an eye on their passenger without being obvious about it. Originally from Montana, Claire replied, settling back against the seat with a barely audible sigh of relief. Small town called Whitefish. Haven't been back there in, well, a long time. What brought you to Portland? Daniel kept his voice casual, but he could sense there was a story there. Probably not a happy one, given the way Claire's shoulders tensed at the question. The bus did, she said with a hollow laugh that held no humor. Greyhound from Fort Bragg. End of the line, I guess. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain seeping through his partially open window. End of the line. There was something ominous about the way she said it, like someone who had run out of places to go and reasons to keep moving. Do you have family here? Lily asked with the innocent directness that only children could manage. Friends, a job. Lily, Daniel warned gently, catching his daughter's eyes in the mirror. Maybe we should let Claire rest. It's been a long day for everyone. But Claire surprised him by answering, no family, no friends, no job. She paused, looking out the window at the rain-soaked city passing by. Guess that makes me officially a woman without a country. The bitterness in her voice made Daniel's chest ache. He recognized that tone, the same one he'd used for months after Rachel's death, when well-meaning friends and family had tried to draw him back into the world of the living. It was the voice of someone who had lost not just their place in the world, but their belief that they deserved to have one. They drove in relative silence for the next few minutes, the only sounds the rhythmic whisper of windshield wipers and the white noise of rain against metal and glass. Daniel found himself stealing glances at Claire in the mirror, trying to piece together her story from the small details he could observe. The way she sat with perfect posture despite obvious exhaustion. The unconscious way her hand kept moving to her left side, as if checking for something that wasn't there. A weapon maybe, or protecting an old injury. The 1,000-yard stare that seemed to see through the present moment into something much darker. "We're almost home," he said, as they turned onto his street, a quiet residential area in southeast Portland, where modest craftsman houses sat beneath towering oak trees that were now skeletal silhouettes against the storm-dark sky. Daniel's house appeared through the rain like a beacon of warmth and safety. It was a simple 2-story home that he and Rachel had bought when Lily was a baby, painted sage green with white trim and a wraparound porch that his wife had lined with flower boxes and hanging ferns. Most of the plants had died after Rachel's passing. Daniel had never inherited her green thumb, but the bones of her garden remained dormant, but not defeated. He pulled into the driveway, noting how Claire's posture straightened as she took in their surroundings. "It's beautiful," she said quietly, and Daniel could hear genuine appreciation in her voice. "Very peaceful." "Mommy designed the garden," Lily said proudly as they all climbed out of the car. "Daddy says she had magic fingers that could make anything grow." Daniel felt the familiar pang of loss at his daughter's words, but tonight it was tempered by something else. A strange sense of rightness about bringing Claire here, as if Rachel herself had guided his decision to stop at that bus stop. They hurried through the rain to the front porch, where Daniel fumbled with his keys while Claire stood shivering beside them. In the yellow glow of the porch light, he could see just how thoroughly soaked she was. Her uniform was plastered to her body, and water was literally dripping from her fingertips. "God, you're freezing," he said, finally getting the door open. "Lily, can you grab some towels from the linen closet? And maybe one of my old sweatshirts from the bedroom?" "On it," Lily announced, disappearing into the house with the efficiency of a child given an important mission. Daniel ushered Claire into the entryway, suddenly seeing his home through a stranger's eyes. The hardwood floors that Rachel had insisted on refinishing themselves. The family photos lining the hallway, mostly of happier times before cancer, had stolen the light from their lives. The living room with its overstuffed couches and the fireplace that still held the half-burned logs from the last fire he'd built weeks ago. "This is lovely," Claire said, and Daniel could tell she meant it. There was something almost hungry in the way she looked around, as if she were trying to memorize every detail of what a real home looked like. "It's nothing fancy," Daniel replied, suddenly self-conscious about the dust on the coffee table and the pile of Lily's homework that he'd been meaning to help her organize. Rachel always said a house wasn't about being perfect, it was about being lived in. Claire turned to look at him directly for the first time since getting in the car, and Daniel felt his breath catch. Even exhausted and bedraggled, even with that scar marking her face and shadows haunting her eyes, she was beautiful in a way that made his chest tight. But more than that, there was something about her that called to parts of himself he'd thought had died with his wife, a recognition that went deeper than physical attraction. "Rachel was your wife?" Claire asked softly. "Is..." Daniel corrected automatically, then caught himself. "Was. Sorry, it's been 3 years, but sometimes I still..." He trailed off, unsure how to explain the way grief could make past and present blur together. Understanding flickered in Claire's eyes, not pity but genuine comprehension. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Here we go." Lily's voice echoed from upstairs, followed by the sound of her feet thundering down the wooden steps. She appeared with an armload of towels and one of Daniel's old Northwestern University sweatshirts. "Daddy, I got the soft towels from the good bathroom, and this sweatshirt smells like your soap." "You're amazing, sweetheart," Daniel said, taking the bundle from his daughter. "Why don't you go get ready for bed while I help Claire get dried off?" But I want to talk to Claire more, Lily protested with a pout that was pure Rachel. She hasn't told us about being a soldier yet. Tomorrow, Daniel said firmly but gently. It's already past your bedtime and Claire needs to get warm and dry. Lily considered this with the seriousness of a child weighing important negotiations. Okay, but Claire, will you still be here in the morning? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Daniel realized he'd been so focused on getting Claire out of the rain that he hadn't actually thought through the logistics of what came next. Where would she sleep? How long would she stay? What exactly was he offering here? Claire looked between Daniel and Lily, something vulnerable and hopeful flickering across her features before she could hide it. If your father doesn't mind, I'd like that very much. Of course, Daniel heard himself saying before his practical mind could object. You can take the guest room. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry. Lily beamed as if she'd personally orchestrated this outcome. Perfect. Good night, Claire. Good night, Daddy. She kissed Daniel's cheek and surprised them both by giving Claire a quick, fierce hug before skipping upstairs. Suddenly, alone with Claire in the quiet entryway, Daniel felt the weight of what he'd done settling over him like a heavy blanket. He'd invited a complete stranger, a woman with obvious trauma and secrets, into his home, into his carefully protected life with his daughter. The responsible part of his brain was screaming warnings about background checks and safety protocols and all the things a single father should consider before making impulsive decisions. But looking at Claire now, seeing the way she stood perfectly still, as if afraid to take up too much space, the way her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the towels he'd given her, Daniel felt only certainty. Whatever her story was, wherever she'd come from, she needed this. And maybe, though he was afraid to examine this thought too closely, maybe he needed it too. The guest room is upstairs, he said quietly. First door on the right. There's a bathroom right across the hall. Help yourself to whatever you need. Hot shower, clean clothes, anything. Claire nodded, still looking overwhelmed by this simple kindness. Thank you. I know this is unusual. Taking in strays isn't exactly standard operating procedure for most people. Maybe not, Daniel agreed. But my wife always said that the best things in life usually happen when you stop following the standard operating procedure. Something shifted in Claire's expression at that, a crack in the armor she'd been wearing allowing a glimpse of the woman underneath. She sounds like she was special. She was, Daniel said simply. I think she would have liked you. The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Claire. He hadn't thought about whether Rachel would approve of his decisions in a long time, had spent so much energy just surviving day to day that he'd stopped asking himself what his wife would do in any given situation. But standing here with Claire, seeing the way she'd gently taken Lily's hug, the way she'd looked at their home with such longing and appreciation, Daniel felt more certain than he had about anything in 3 years. Rachel would have brought Claire home too. She would have seen the same brokenness that Daniel recognized, the same desperate need for human connection and healing. Get some rest, he said, stepping back to give Claire space to head upstairs. We'll figure out everything else tomorrow. Claire nodded, clutching the towels and sweatshirt to her chest like lifelines. Daniel, she said as she reached the bottom of the stairs. Yeah. Thank you for stopping. She gestured vaguely at the house around them, at the warmth and safety he was offering. For seeing me. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow, carrying layers of meaning that went far beyond gratitude for a ride and a place to sleep. He understood on a level that bypassed rational thought that Claire hadn't felt truly seen by another human being in a very long time. That she'd been invisible, forgotten, lost in whatever maze of pain and trauma had led her to that bus stop tonight. Thank you for letting us help, he replied and meant it. He watched her climb the stairs, noting the slight favor she gave her left leg and the way she kept one hand on the banister as if for support. When he heard the guest room door close with a soft click, Daniel finally allowed himself to really think about what he'd done. He'd brought home a wounded soldier with no family, no friends, no job, and nowhere else to go. A woman with secrets written in the scars on her face and the shadows in her eyes. A stranger who could be dangerous, unstable, or simply more broken than he had the resources to help heal. But as Daniel moved through his nighttime routine, checking locks, turning off lights, making sure Lily was settled, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. A sense of purpose that went beyond simply surviving until the next day. For the first time since Rachel's death, he was thinking about tomorrow, not as something to endure, but as something that might actually matter. Upstairs, he could hear the sound of water running in the guest bathroom, Claire taking that hot shower he'd offered. The sound was oddly comforting, a sign of life and renewal in a house that had felt too quiet for too long. Daniel paused outside Lily's room, listening to his daughter's even breathing and feeling a familiar swell of fierce protectiveness. Whatever happened next, whatever Claire's story turned out to be, his first responsibility was to his daughter. He would not let his impulse to help a stranger put Lily in any kind of danger. But as he finally headed to his own bedroom, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that tonight had been more than chance. That Rachel had somehow guided him to that bus stop, had whispered in his ear to stop the car, and open their home to someone who needed it as desperately as he and Lily needed to remember how to live again. In the guest room, Claire Donovan stood under the spray of hot water and let herself cry for the first time in months. The tears mixed with the shower water washing away days of exhaustion and fear, and the terrible certainty that she had nowhere left to turn. For just this moment, surrounded by the simple luxury of clean water and soap that smelled like lavender, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as lost as she'd thought. Tomorrow would bring questions and decisions and the hard work of figuring out what came next. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Claire Donovan was warm, safe, and not alone. And in the house below, Daniel Hayes lay awake, listening to the rain against his windows and thinking about second chances, about the way broken people sometimes found each other exactly when they needed it most, and about the possibility that healing might come in forms he'd never expected. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside their small sanctuary, 3 damaged souls had found their way to the beginning of something new. The morning sun filtered through the guest room curtains like liquid gold, painting soft patterns across Claire's face as consciousness slowly returned. For a moment, she lay perfectly still, disoriented by the unfamiliar sensation of waking up somewhere that felt safe. The bed was soft beneath her body, a luxury she'd almost forgotten existed, and the room smelled faintly of lavender and old books, rather than the harsh disinfectant and fear that had permeated her world for so long. Then reality crashed back like a cold wave. She was in a stranger's house, had accepted charity from people who knew nothing about her past, about the things she'd done, about the reasons she'd been sitting at that bus stop with nowhere left to go. The familiar panic began to rise in her chest, that crushing weight that made breathing feel impossible. But before it could fully take hold, she heard something that stopped her cold. Laughter. Real, genuine laughter, drifting up from downstairs, followed by the clatter of dishes and the warm murmur of conversation. When was the last time she'd woken up to sounds like that? When was the last time she'd been anywhere that felt remotely like a home instead of a barracks, a hospital, or a motel room that smelled like desperation and broken dreams? Claire sat up slowly, her body protesting the movement. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left their marked shrapnel scars that ached in the rain, a left knee that would never quite work right again, and nerve damage in her shoulder that sent shooting pains down her arm when she moved wrong. But it was the invisible wounds that hurt the most, the ones that made her wake up fighting invisible enemies and left her feeling like a stranger in her own skin. She padded to the window and looked out at Daniel's backyard, gasping softly at what she saw. Even dormant in late autumn, the garden was clearly the work of someone who had loved it deeply. Raised beds laid out in careful geometric patterns, fruit trees that probably burst with blossoms in spring, and a greenhouse that looked like it had been built by hand with infinite patience and care. It was exactly the kind of place she'd dreamed about during those endless nights on watch duty in Kandahar. Peaceful, purposeful, alive with the promise of growth and renewal. "Claire, are you awake?" Lily's voice called from the bottom of the stairs, sweet and tentative. "Daddy made pancakes, and they're really good, but they'll get cold if you don't come down soon." The simple invitation hit Claire harder than enemy fire ever had. When was the last time someone had called her name like that, with warmth instead of authority, with welcome instead of warning? She pressed her palm against the cool window glass and tried to steady herself. Tried to remember how to be a person instead of a soldier. How to exist in a world where pancakes mattered more than perimeter security. "I'll be right down," she called back, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. She dressed quickly in the clothes Daniel had provided, a pair of jeans that were slightly too long, and a Northwestern University sweatshirt that smelled like cedar and something indefinably masculine. The fabric was soft against her skin, worn comfortable by years of washing, and she found herself pressing the sleeves to her face and breathing in the scent of safety. Downstairs, the kitchen was bathed in morning light that made everything look like a Norman Rockwell painting. Daniel stood at the stove flipping pancakes with the easy competence of a man who'd mastered the art of single parenthood, while Lily sat at the breakfast table arranging sliced strawberries in precise patterns on her plate. The domestic scene was so perfect, so normal, that Claire felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred. "Good morning," Daniel said, glancing over his shoulder with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Claire admitted, sliding into the chair Lily indicated with an enthusiastic pat. "Thank you for everything." "Daddy says you were in the army," Lily announced, fixing Claire with the intense stare that only children could manage. "Did you ever fight bad guys?" "Lily," Daniel warned gently, setting a plate of golden pancakes in front of Claire. "Remember what we talked about. Some questions are too personal for breakfast conversation." But Claire found herself smiling for the first time in recent memory. "It's okay. Yes, I was in the army, and yes, sometimes I had to fight bad guys, but mostly I tried to help good people stay safe." Like a superhero. Lily's eyes widened with the kind of hero worship that made Claire's chest tight with unworthiness. "Not exactly," Claire said carefully, cutting her pancakes into small, precise pieces, a habit born of eating MREs in hostile territory where you never knew when you might have to grab your weapon and run. "More like a guardian. Someone who stands watch so other people can sleep peacefully." Daniel's eyes met hers across the table, and Claire saw understanding there that made her breath catch. He got it understood that she was trying to explain her service in terms a child could process without revealing the darker realities of what she'd actually done. The people she'd killed, the friends she'd watched die. "That's exactly what superheroes do," Lily declared with the absolute certainty of an 8-year-old. "They protect people. Daddy protects me, and Mommy used to protect both of us before she went to heaven." The casual mention of death, delivered with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children somehow managed, made Claire's fork pause halfway to her mouth. She looked at Daniel, seeing the brief shadow that crossed his features before he managed to smooth his expression back into something neutral. "Your mommy sounds like she was very special," Claire said quietly. "She was the best," Lily agreed, then brightened with the resilience that seemed to be her default setting. "But now we have you for breakfast, which makes today special too." The innocent words hit Claire like shrapnel to the chest. When was the last time anyone had considered her presence a gift instead of a burden? When was the last time she'd sat at a table like this, surrounded by warmth and acceptance, instead of the careful distance her fellow soldiers had maintained once word got out about her discharge status? "So, what's the plan for today?" Daniel asked, settling into his own chair with coffee that smelled like heaven. "I don't have any appointments until this afternoon. I work from home, mostly watch repair and restoration. We could show you around the neighborhood or just take it easy, whatever you're comfortable with." The casual offer of companionship, of shared time with no agenda other than human connection, made Claire's throat tight. "I should probably figure out. I need to start looking for work, find a place to stay. I can't impose on your hospitality indefinitely." "You're not imposing," Daniel said firmly, and something in his tone made Claire look up from her pancakes. "Look, I don't know your story, and you don't have to tell me anything you're not ready to share. But you're welcome here as long as you need to be. No questions, no expectations, no timeline." "But why?" The words escaped before Claire could stop them, raw with confusion and something that might have been hope. "You don't know anything about me. I could be dangerous, unstable, a criminal for all you know." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, absently turning his coffee mug in slow circles while he considered his answer. 3 years ago, I was in the darkest place I'd ever been. Lost, angry, barely functioning. And people helped me not because I deserved it, not because I'd earned it, but because sometimes that's what humans do for each other. We reach out when someone's drowning, even if we don't know how they ended up in the water. His honesty was like a sucker punch to Claire's solar plexus. She'd expected platitudes, maybe religious obligation, or bleeding heart liberal guilt. But this was something deeper: recognition of shared pain, of understanding what it meant to lose everything that gave your life meaning, and have to find a way to keep breathing anyway. I was discharged for mental health reasons, she said quietly, the words falling into the warm kitchen air like stones into still water. PTSD, they called it, though. That's just a fancy way of saying I couldn't handle the job anymore. Couldn't trust my own judgment. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't stop seeing threats everywhere I looked. She waited for the change in their expressions, for the subtle shift that always came when people learned she was damaged goods. But Daniel just nodded, and Lily continued arranging her strawberries as if Claire had announced something as mundane as the weather. "How long were you deployed?" Daniel asked. 3 tours. 7 years total with time between deployments. Claire found herself talking more freely than she had to any of her therapists. "I loved it at first, the structure, the purpose, feeling like I was making a difference. But it changes you being in a place where every day might be your last, where split-second decisions determine who lives and who dies. Did you lose friends?" Lily's question was asked with the gentle directness that only children possessed, and Claire felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. I lost friends." Claire's voice went rough around the edges. "Good people who deserve to come home to their families." "Like cancer took Mommy," Lily said with devastating simplicity. "Sometimes bad things happen to good people, and it's not fair, but it's not anybody's fault either." The 8-year-old's wisdom hit Claire like a sledgehammer to the chest. She'd spent months drowning in survivor's guilt, convinced that she should have been the one who didn't make it home, that her friends had been better soldiers, better people, more deserving of life than she was. But here was this child who had lost her mother to an enemy as merciless as any insurgent, offering forgiveness that Claire couldn't give herself. "You're very wise." Claire managed her voice thick with emotion. "Daddy says, I get that from Mommy," Lily replied matter-of-factly. She always knew the right thing to say when people were sad. Daniel reached across the table and squeezed his daughter's hand, his love for her so evident it made Claire's chest ache with longing. When was the last time someone had looked at her like that, with unconditional love and pride instead of pity or concern? "So what kind of work are you looking for?" Daniel asked smoothly, steering the conversation back to practical matters with the skill of someone who'd learned to navigate difficult emotional territory. "I might know people who are hiring." Claire shrugged, suddenly feeling foolish. "I don't really have civilian job skills. I can strip and clean an M4 carbine in under 2 minutes, coordinate tactical strikes, and keep a convoy moving through hostile territory, but none of that translates well to the job market." "You'd be surprised," Daniel said thoughtfully. "Leadership, problem-solving under pressure, attention to detail, ability to work in high-stress situations. Those are all valuable skills. Have you thought about security work? Private contracting? Even something like project management might be a good fit." The suggestion was offered so casually, with such matter-of-fact confidence in her abilities, that Claire felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. For months, everyone from VA counselors to well-meaning family friends had talked about her service like it was a liability, something to overcome rather than a foundation to build on. "I hadn't really thought about it like that," she admitted. "The discharge made me feel like everything I'd been was worthless. Like I'd failed at the only thing I was ever good at." "Bullshit," Daniel said firmly, then glanced at Lily with an apologetic grimace. "Sorry, sweetheart. Bad word." "It's okay, Daddy. Sometimes grown-ups need strong words to say important things," Lily replied with the magnanimous air of someone granting royal dispensation. Daniel turned back to Claire, his expression intense. "You served 3 tours. You kept your fellow soldiers alive. You answered the call when your country needed you, and you gave everything you had until you literally couldn't give anymore. That's not failure. That's heroism." The conviction in his voice made Claire's eyes burn with unshed tears. "It doesn't feel heroic. It feels like I broke when other people stayed strong." "Everyone breaks eventually," Daniel said quietly. "The trick is finding people who will help you put the pieces back together." The moment stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding, and something that felt dangerously like hope. Claire found herself studying Daniel's face in the golden morning light, the way grief had carved lines around his eyes, but hadn't diminished the kindness there, the strength in his jaw that suggested he'd weathered storms and come out standing, the gentle hands that had learned to braid his daughter's hair and flip pancakes with equal skill. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said impulsively. "Of course." "Why aren't you angry at God, at the universe, at the unfairness of losing your wife so young? I've seen what losing people does to soldiers, and most of us come home looking for someone to blame, something to fight. But you seem peaceful isn't the right word, but accepting maybe." Daniel was quiet for so long that Claire began to worry she'd overstepped, had pushed too far into personal territory that was none of her business. But when he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. "I was angry. For the first year after Rachel died, I was furious at everything, God, the doctors, who couldn't save her, myself for not being able to protect her, even her sometimes for leaving us behind." He glanced at Lily, who was listening with the solemn attention of a child who'd heard this story before. "But anger is exhausting, and I had Lily to think about. She needed me to be more than just a bitter man drowning in grief." "So you just decided not to be angry anymore?" Claire asked, skeptical. "It wasn't that simple. I had help grief counseling friends who refused to let me disappear completely, and mostly this little girl who reminded me every day that life was still worth living." Daniel's smile was soft as he looked at his daughter. "Rachel used to say that love doesn't end when someone dies, it just changes form. So instead of being angry about losing her, I try to honor her by being the kind of man she fell in love with, the kind of father she would be proud of." The simple profundity of his words hit Claire like a physical blow. She thought about her own losses, Marcus, who'd stepped on an IED while on patrol with her unit; Sarah, the medic, who'd bled out in Claire's arms after a sniper attack; Tommy, the kid from Ohio who'd been 3 weeks from going home when a mortar round found their forward operating base. How different might her life have been if she'd found a way to honor their memory instead of drowning in guilt over surviving when they didn't. "That's beautiful," she said quietly, "and incredibly difficult." "Most worthwhile things are," Daniel replied. "But I had help, and that made all the difference. Maybe that's why I stopped last night, not just because you needed help, but because helping you helps me remember who I want to be." The admission was offered so honestly, without self-congratulation or false modesty, that Claire felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. For months, she'd felt like a burden on everyone around her. The therapists who had to find ways to fix her broken mind, the fellow veterans who had to watch her fall apart, the family who'd tried and failed to understand what she'd been through. But here was someone suggesting that her presence might actually be a gift rather than an obligation. "I need to make some phone calls today," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Check in with the VA about my benefits, see about getting my personal effects shipped from storage, figure out the practical stuff." "You can use the landline in my office," Daniel offered. "It's private and you won't have to worry about cell phone charges." "Thank you." Claire hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Would it be okay if I stayed a few more days, just until I can figure out where I'm going next?" "Yes," Lily exclaimed before Daniel could answer. "You can help me with my piano practice, and Daddy can show you his workshop, and we can make dinner together and maybe watch movies." Daniel laughed, the sound rich and warm in the morning kitchen. What she said. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need to Claire. No pressure, no expectations." The offer should have felt overwhelming charity from strangers who owed her nothing. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long, difficult journey through hostile territory. For the first time since her discharge, Claire allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond simply surviving until the next day. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'd like that." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of comfortable domesticity that felt surreal after months of isolation. Claire helped clear the breakfast dishes, marveling at the easy rhythm Daniel and Lily had developed wordless communication born of shared loss and the necessity of taking care of each other. She watched Daniel work at his kitchen desk repairing an antique pocket watch with the same gentle precision he'd shown in caring for his daughter, and found herself fascinated by the delicate instruments and magnifying equipment that transformed their dining room into a workspace. "It's beautiful," she said, drawn to the watch despite herself. "How did you learn to do this?" "Rachel's grandfather was a watchmaker," Daniel explained, not looking up from the tiny gears he was adjusting with tweezers. "He taught me the basics as a hobby, but after she died, I found that working with my hands helped quiet my mind. There's something soothing about taking something broken and making it work again." The metaphor wasn't lost on Claire, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks as she wondered if Daniel saw her as another broken thing to be fixed. But when he glanced up at her, his expression was thoughtful, rather than pitying. "Would you like to try?" he asked. "It's meditative, and you've got the steady hands of someone who's handled precision instruments before." Claire found herself nodding before she could overthink the offer. Daniel guided her to his chair and positioned a magnifying lens over a different watch, one that was clearly less valuable, meant for practice rather than perfection. His hands covered hers as he showed her how to hold the tools, how to apply just enough pressure to move the delicate components without damaging them. The contact was brief and professional, but Claire felt it like an electric shock through her entire nervous system. When was the last time someone had touched her without medical necessity or casual cruelty? When was the last time she'd felt the warmth of another person's skin against hers and not immediately cataloged it as a potential threat? "Like this," Daniel murmured, his breath warm against her ear as he guided her movements. "Feel the resistance, but don't fight it. Sometimes the gentlest touch is the most effective." Claire's hands trembled slightly as she tried to follow his instructions, hyper-aware of his proximity and the way his presence seemed to calm the constant background noise of anxiety that had become her default state. The tiny gear clicked into place under her careful manipulation, and she felt a surprising rush of accomplishment. "Perfect," Daniel said, his voice warm with approval. "You're a natural." The praise hit Claire harder than any military commendation she'd ever received. This wasn't about her ability to follow orders or execute dangerous missions. This was about creating something beautiful about the gentle art of restoration rather than destruction. "It's peaceful," she said, surprised by the truth of it. "I can see why you find it soothing. Rachel used to say I disappeared into my own world when I worked on watches," Daniel said, settling into a chair beside her. "She'd have to call my name 3 times before I'd hear her." "Do you miss her more or less when you're working?" Claire asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "Sorry, that's none of my business. It's okay." And the answer is both. Daniel's expression grew distant, contemplative. "When I'm focused on a repair, the grief quiets down to a manageable level. But afterward, when I finish a piece, the first thing I want to do is show it to her, tell her about the problem I solved or the story behind the watch. That's when the loss hits hardest, not having her to share the small victories with." Claire nodded, understanding more than she wanted to admit. "I know that feeling. Different context, but after firefights, after successful missions, there was always this moment of wanting to call someone to share the relief and adrenaline with someone who'd understand. But there was never anyone on the other end of that call." "No family?" Daniel asked gently. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 19. That's actually what made me join the army. I needed structure, purpose, somewhere to belong." Claire's voice went flat as she recited the facts. No siblings, no significant other who was willing to wait through 3 deployments. The army was my family, and when they decided I was too broken to serve... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. How could she explain the devastating loneliness of being cut loose from the only identity she'd ever claimed, set adrift in a civilian world that felt foreign and hostile? "You're not broken." Lily's voice piped up from the living room where she'd been coloring while they worked. You're just different now, like Daddy was after Mommy died. Different doesn't mean broken. Once again, the child's wisdom cut straight to the heart of things adults spent months trying to articulate in therapy sessions. Claire felt tears prick her eyes at the simple acceptance in Lily's voice, the matter-of-fact kindness that seemed to come as naturally to her as breathing. Out of the mouths of babes, Daniel said softly, his eyes meeting Claire's with an intensity that made her stomach flutter in ways she'd almost forgotten were possible. The afternoon drifted by in a haze of simple pleasures that felt revolutionary after months of bare survival. Claire made her phone calls from Daniel's office, navigating the bureaucratic maze of the VA with renewed determination now that she had a stable address to use for paperwork. She arranged for her belongings to be shipped from the storage unit in North Carolina, where she'd hastily dumped them after her discharge, and even managed to schedule an appointment with a local therapist who specialized in veteran transitions. When she emerged from the office, she found Daniel and Lily in the garden, examining the dormant beds with the focused attention of people planning a resurrection. The November air was crisp but not unpleasant, and the weak sunshine felt like a blessing after the previous night's storm. "Planning for spring?" Claire asked, joining them beside what looked like it had once been an elaborate herb garden. "Daddy's trying to decide if we should plant the same things Mommy did or try something new," Lily explained, her small hands running over the frost-killed stems with surprising gentleness. "I think we should plant some of both old things to remember her and new things to show we're still growing." The poetic wisdom of the statement made Claire's breath catch, and she saw Daniel's expression mirror her own wonder at his daughter's insight. "That sounds perfect," Claire said quietly. "What kinds of things did your mom like to grow?" "Everything," Lily said with the sweeping enthusiasm of childhood. "Tomatoes and basil and rosemary and lavender and roses and sunflowers and pumpkins and carrots and green beans and strawberries and mint and—" "She was ambitious," Daniel interjected with a fond smile. "Rachel believed in abundance. She'd rather plant too much and give away the surplus than risk not having enough to share." "Sharing was important to her?" Claire asked, filing away another piece of the puzzle that was Daniel's lost wife. "Essential," Daniel confirmed. "She grew up poor, and I think that made her want to create abundance for everyone around her. The neighbors used to joke that our garden fed half the block during harvest season." Claire found herself imagining Rachel Hayes, a woman who'd planted enough food to feed an army, who'd raised a daughter wise beyond her years, who'd loved a man so completely that he was still guided by her memory 3 years after her death. The picture that emerged was of someone Claire would have liked enormously, and the thought brought both comfort and an unexpected stab of jealousy. "Would you help us plan the new garden?" Lily asked, slipping her small hand into Claire's with the casual trust that children either gave freely or withheld completely. "You could pick some things you like to eat, and we could grow them together." The simple offer hit Claire like a physical blow. When was the last time anyone had asked her to be part of something ongoing, something that extended beyond immediate crisis into an imagined future, where she belonged, somewhere contributed something meaningful? "I'd love that," she said, her voice rough with emotion. "Though I should warn you, I've never grown anything more complex than mold in a coffee cup." Daniel laughed, the sound warming the cool air between them. "We'll start you off easy. Maybe some lettuce, some herbs, gateway vegetables." "Gateway vegetables?" Claire raised an eyebrow. "The theory is that once you successfully grow one thing, you get addicted to the feeling of nurturing life instead of just taking it away," Daniel explained, then paused as he realized what he'd said. "Sorry, I didn't mean—" "It's okay," Claire interrupted, touched by his concern, but not offended by the truth. "You're right. I've spent so many years focused on ending threats, stopping bad things from happening. The idea of making something grow, of creating, instead of destroying, it sounds like therapy I might actually enjoy." The admission surprised her with its honesty. She'd been dreading the mandatory counseling sessions, the probing questions about her feelings, and the endless dissection of traumatic memories. But this, working with her hands in the soil, nurturing something from seed to harvest, felt like healing she could actually embrace. "Spring's still months away," Daniel pointed out. "But we could start some seeds indoors, get a head start on the season. And there are some cold weather crops we could plant now, if you're interested in getting your hands dirty sooner rather than later. Really? Claire felt a flutter of excitement that she hadn't experienced in longer than she could remember. What kinds of things? Garlic, onions, some hardy greens that don't mind frost. Lily rattled off with the expertise of someone who'd been absorbing garden wisdom since birth. And we could start planning where everything else will go, draw maps and measure spaces and order seeds from catalogs. The prospect of planning for a future that extended beyond next week felt both thrilling and terrifying. Claire had been living day to day for so long that the idea of making commitments 6 months out seemed impossibly optimistic. "I might not still be here in the spring," she said quietly, the words escaping before she could stop them. "But you might be," Daniel said simply, his eyes holding hers with steady certainty. "And if you are, we'll have vegetables. If you're not, Lily and I will think of you every time we harvest something you helped plant." The matter-of-fact acceptance of uncertainty, the refusal to let the possibility of loss prevent them from investing in hope, it was so different from the military mindset that had governed Claire's life for so long. In the army, you planned for every contingency, prepared for the worst-case scenario, and never counted on anything good lasting. But standing in Daniel's dormant garden with Lily's warm hand in hers and the possibility of spring stretching ahead like a promise, Claire felt something shift inside her chest. Maybe it was time to start planning for the best-case scenario instead of just trying to survive the worst. "Okay," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Let's plant something." The next 3 weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and achingly familiar to Claire, like remembering a song she'd heard in childhood but couldn't quite place. She woke each morning to the sound of Lily's laughter echoing through the house, Daniel's quiet humming as he made coffee, and the gentle domestic symphony that had been absent from her life for so long that she'd forgotten such peace was possible. By the second week, she'd found part-time work at a security consulting firm downtown. Nothing glamorous, just reviewing protocols and training materials for corporate clients. But it was honest work that paid enough to contribute to household expenses, despite Daniel's protests. The structure felt good, the purposeful use of skills she'd thought were worthless in civilian life. More importantly, it gave her a reason to leave the house each day and return to it each evening, creating the illusion that she belonged somewhere. She'd also started seeing Dr. Martinez, the therapist who specialized in veteran transitions. The sessions were difficult but productive, slowly chipping away at the walls Claire had built around her trauma. Dr. Martinez didn't push for details about specific incidents, instead focusing on what she called functional recovery, learning to live with the ghosts instead of being haunted by them. "You're making remarkable progress," Dr. Martinez had said during their most recent session. "Whatever's different in your environment, it's clearly supporting your healing process." Claire knew exactly what was different. For the first time since her discharge, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. And that living was happening in Daniel's house, in the warm cocoon of safety he and Lily had created around her without even seeming to try. But it was the evenings that had become precious to her, those quiet hours after dinner when Lily practiced piano in the living room, while Daniel worked on his watches at the kitchen table, and Claire read or helped with homework or simply existed in the warm bubble of their shared space. Tonight was no different, except for the tension that had been building between her and Daniel like atmospheric pressure before a storm. It had started small, lingering glances that lasted a heartbeat too long, the brush of fingers when they reached for the same dish, the way Daniel's eyes followed her movements when he thought she wasn't looking. Nothing inappropriate, nothing that crossed the careful boundaries they'd established as housemates. But the awareness was there, electric and undeniable, charging the air between them with possibilities neither seemed ready to acknowledge. Claire sat curled in Rachel's old reading chair, a fact that Daniel had mentioned casually, without seeming to realize the weight of what he was offering, with a book about organic gardening open in her lap. But she wasn't reading. Instead, she was watching Daniel work, fascinated by the intense concentration on his face, as he adjusted tiny mechanisms with instruments that seemed impossibly delicate. "What's that one?" she asked quietly, not wanting to disturb Lily's halting progress through a Chopin piece. Daniel looked up. his eyes taking a moment to focus on the present. Omega Speedmaster 1967. The owner's grandfather wore it to Vietnam. He held up the watch, its face catching the warm light from the table lamp. It stopped working after he died, and the family wants it restored as a memorial. The mention of Vietnam sent a familiar chill through Claire's chest, but it was tempered by something else: recognition of the sacred trust Daniel held in his hands. That's beautiful. The idea of bringing something back to life to honor someone's memory. That's most of what I do, actually, Daniel said, setting the watch down carefully. People don't just want their timepieces fixed, they want their connection to the past restored. This watch carries 53 years of someone's life. Every scratch, every worn spot on the band tells a story. Claire found herself leaning forward, drawn by the reverence in his voice. Do you ever feel the weight of that responsibility? Knowing that you're holding someone's history in your hands? Every day, Daniel admitted. But it's a good weight if that makes sense. It reminds me that everything we do, every moment we live matters to someone. Even after we're gone, we leave traces of ourselves in the things we touch, the people we love. The conversation was interrupted by a discordant crash of piano keys, followed by Lily's frustrated sigh. This is impossible. My fingers won't go where they're supposed to, and it sounds terrible. Daniel started to rise, but Claire was already moving, crossing to the piano bench, where Lily sat with tears of frustration threatening in her eyes. May I? Claire asked, settling beside the little girl. Do you play piano? Lily asked hopefully. A little. My mom taught me when I was about your age. Claire's fingers found the keys, tentatively muscle memory guiding them through the opening bars of the piece Lily had been struggling with. The notes came back to her slowly, rusty but recognizable, and she felt an unexpected stab of grief for her mother, who died before seeing her daughter serve her country, before knowing the woman Claire would become, or fail to become. You're really good, Lily breathed, scooting closer on the bench. Can you teach me the hard part? Let's try it together, Claire suggested, positioning Lily's small hands over the keys. The secret is not to think about the individual notes. Think about the story the music is telling. What do you think this piece is about? Lily tilted her head, considering. It sounds sad but pretty. Like remembering something beautiful that you miss. Claire's breath caught at the 8-year-old's insight. That's exactly right. Now play it like you're telling that story, not just hitting the right keys. They worked through the passage together, Claire's hands guiding Lily's until the melody began to emerge with something approaching grace. Behind them, she could hear Daniel moving around the kitchen, the quiet sounds of him cleaning up from dinner, but she could feel his attention on them, like a warm weight between her shoulder blades. Much better, Claire said, as Lily managed the difficult transition without stumbling. You have good instincts. Trust them. Mommy used to say that too, Lily said softly, her fingers still resting on the keys. She said music wasn't about being perfect, it was about telling the truth. The simple statement hit Claire like a physical blow. Tell the truth. When was the last time she'd done that? When had she last allowed herself to feel something without immediately analyzing it for tactical disadvantages or potential threats? Your mom sounds like she was very wise, Claire managed. She was. Daddy says I have her musical ear, but his stubborn streak. Lily grinned, the moment of melancholy passing with the resilience that seemed to be her default setting. Will you play something else? Something you picked? Claire hesitated, then let her fingers find a different melody, something soft and hopeful that her mother had played during happier times before cancer and car accidents and war had taught her that beautiful things were always temporary. She wasn't aware of singing until she heard her own voice, rusty from disuse, but still capable of carrying a tune. That's beautiful. Daniel's voice came from directly behind them, close enough that Claire could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I've never heard it before. My mother's favorite lullaby, Claire replied, her hands stilling on the keys. She used to say it was about finding your way home no matter how lost you got. I like that, Lily said decisively. Will you teach it to me? I want to learn songs that mean something, not just exercises that sound like math homework. Claire laughed, despite the emotion clogging her throat. Of course, but it's getting late, and little girls need their sleep if they're going to master complicated pieces. Do I have to? Lily whined with theatrical despair. I'm having so much fun, and tomorrow's Saturday, so I can sleep in. Nice try, but rules are rules, Daniel said, ruffling his daughter's hair with obvious affection. Go brush your teeth. I'll be up in a few minutes to say goodnight. Lily sighed dramatically but obediently headed upstairs, calling over her shoulder. Claire, will you still be here when I wake up? The question had become a nightly ritual, and each time it hit Claire with the same mixture of warmth and terror. I'll be here, she promised, as she had every night for 3 weeks. Good, Lily said with satisfaction. I like having you here. The house feels more like a family now. Her footsteps faded up the stairs, leaving Claire and Daniel alone in the warm glow of the living room lamps. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and careful boundaries that felt increasingly artificial. She's getting attached, Daniel said quietly, settling onto the couch with careful distance between them. We both are. Claire's heart stuttered at the admission. Is that a problem? I don't know, Daniel said honestly. 3 weeks ago, I would have said yes. Lily's been through enough loss for one childhood, and I've gotten comfortable with our routine, our safety net of just the two of us against the world. And now? Claire asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped between his knees as he stared at something only he could see. Now, I'm starting to remember what it feels like to want something beyond just getting through each day. The words hung in the air between them like a confession, and Claire felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble a little more. For 3 weeks they'd been dancing around this growing awareness, this pull that had nothing to do with gratitude or convenience, and everything to do with the way Daniel's smile could chase away her nightmares, the way his presence made her feel human instead of just a collection of symptoms and scars. Daniel, she started, but he held up a hand to stop her. I know what you're going to say, he said, finally looking at her directly. You're going to tell me that you're not ready for this, that you're still figuring out who you are outside the military, that you don't want to hurt Lily or complicate our living situation. And you'd be right about all of it. Claire opened her mouth to protest, then closed it again because he was absolutely right. Those were exactly the reasonable, sensible objections she'd been rehearsing in her head for days. The logical barriers she'd erected against the growing warmth in her chest whenever he looked at her like she was something precious instead of broken. But here's the thing. Daniel continued, his voice soft but steady. I'm tired of making decisions based on fear of what might go wrong. For 3 years, I've been so focused on protecting Lily from any more loss that I forgot she might also benefit from gaining something beautiful. And what if I can't be that? Claire asked, the words scraping her throat raw. What if the beautiful thing you think you see in me is just wishful thinking? What if I'm too damaged to be anything but a burden? Daniel stood up then, crossing to where she still sat at the piano bench and crouched down so they were at eye level. His hands came up to frame her face with gentle care, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Claire, he said, his voice rough with emotion, do you know what I see when I look at you? She shook her head, not trusting her voice. I see someone who's been through hell and came out fighting. I see a woman who saved lives, who put herself in harm's way to protect people she'd never met. I see someone who's spent 3 weeks in our home and made it brighter just by being here, who helped my daughter with homework and piano and garden planning like it was the most natural thing in the world. Daniel, she tried to interrupt, but he wasn't finished. I see someone who makes Lily laugh more than she has since her mother died. Someone who brings me coffee in the morning without being asked and remembers exactly how I like it. Someone who sits with me in comfortable silence while I work and makes me remember that I'm not just a father or a widower, I'm a man. His words were like water on parched earth, filling spaces inside her that she'd thought were permanently barren. But the fear was still there. The bone-deep certainty that she would eventually disappoint him, hurt him, prove unworthy of the faith he was placing in her. What if I have an episode? She whispered. What if I wake up screaming from nightmares or freeze up in the middle of a perfectly normal day because something triggers a flashback? What if I break down completely and Lily sees it? Then we'll deal with it, Daniel said simply. Together, the same way we'd deal with any other challenge that came our way. It's not that simple, isn't it? Daniel's eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Claire, do you think Rachel never had bad days? Do you think grief is clean and predictable and easy to manage? Do you think Lily hasn't already seen me fall apart more times than I can count? The questions hit her like small revelations. She'd been so focused on her own brokenness that she'd forgotten everyone carried damage of some kind, that a family wasn't a perfect unit, but a group of imperfect people choosing to love each other anyway. Lily has nightmares sometimes, Daniel continued softly, about losing me the way she lost her mother. I have days when I can barely function, when the weight of raising her alone feels impossible. We're all broken in different ways, Claire. The question isn't whether you're damaged, it's whether you're willing to let us help you heal the same way you've been helping us. I don't know how, she admitted, the words barely audible. I don't know how to be part of a family. I don't know how to trust that good things can last, or that I deserve them in the first place. Neither do I, Daniel said with a smile that was both sad and hopeful. I haven't exactly been practicing, but maybe we can figure it out together. Before she could lose her nerve, before the rational part of her brain could catalog all the reasons this was a terrible idea, Claire leaned forward and kissed him. It was supposed to be soft tentative, a question rather than a statement. But the moment their lips met, something ignited between them that had been building for weeks. Not just desire, though that was certainly part of it, but recognition. A sense of coming home that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with finding someone who understood the particular shape of your wounds. Daniel's arms came around her, pulling her closer, and Claire felt herself melting into his warmth like someone who'd been cold for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to be warm. His hands tangled in her hair, his breath mingled with hers, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the constant background noise of anxiety in her head went completely quiet. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Daniel rested his forehead against hers. "Stay," he whispered, and Claire knew he wasn't just talking about tonight or tomorrow or even next week. He was asking her to stay in the fullest sense, to stop running, to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop, to choose them the way they were choosing her. "I'm scared," she admitted, her hands fisted in the fabric of his shirt. "Good," Daniel said, his smile soft and understanding. "That means it matters." From upstairs came Lily's voice calling for her father to come say goodnight, and the spell between them broke just enough for reality to creep back in. But as Daniel stood and offered Claire his hand as she took it and let him pull her to her feet, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not healing exactly, that would take time, but the recognition that healing was possible, that she wasn't condemned to spend the rest of her life as a casualty of war. "Daddy!" Lily's voice came again, more insistent this time. "Coming, sweetheart," Daniel called back, but his eyes never left Claire's face. "Will you be here when I come back down?" Claire nodded, not trusting her voice. She watched him climb the stairs, then wandered to the window that looked out over the backyard where they'd been planting their spring garden. In the darkness, she could just make out the shapes of the dormant beds waiting for warmth and light, and the patient work of nurturing new growth. She thought about the seeds they'd planted the previous weekend, garlic and onions that would spend the winter underground gathering strength for spring. It seemed like a metaphor too obvious to ignore, but Claire found she didn't mind the heavy-handedness of hope. For too long, she'd been focused on endings, the end of her military career, the end of her old identity, the end of everything she'd thought she wanted from life. Maybe it was time to start thinking about beginnings instead. When Daniel returned 20 minutes later, he found her still at the window, but she'd turned on the outside lights so she could see the garden more clearly. He came up behind her, his reflection joining hers in the glass, and slowly, carefully wrapped his arms around her waist. "Having second thoughts?" he asked quietly, and she could hear the vulnerability underneath the casual tone. Third and fourth thoughts, Claire admitted, leaning back against his chest. But not the kind you're worried about. What kind, then? Claire took a breath, gathering courage she wasn't sure she possessed. I keep thinking about permanence, about what it would mean to really stay, not just as a house guest, but as... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. As family, Daniel supplied gently. Family, Claire repeated, testing the word on her tongue. It's terrifying. The best things usually are, Daniel said, echoing his earlier words. His arms tightened around her slightly, a gesture of reassurance and promise. We don't have to figure it all out tonight, Claire. We can take it as slow as you need. And if I have setbacks, if the PTSD gets worse instead of better, if I turn out to be more trouble than I'm worth. Daniel was quiet for a moment, and Claire held her breath, waiting for him to admit that yes, those were valid concerns, that perhaps they should be more careful about rushing into something that could end badly for everyone involved. Instead, he turned her in his arms so she was facing him, his hands coming up to cup her face with the same gentleness he'd shown earlier. Claire, do you remember what you told Lily about playing piano? About trusting her instincts? Claire nodded, unsure where he was going with this. My instincts are telling me that you're not going anywhere. That whatever brought you to that bus stop 3 weeks ago, whatever force in the universe decided I should drive down Morrison Street at exactly the right moment to find you, that wasn't random. That was the best kind of destiny, the kind you have to choose to believe in. You really think that? Claire asked, searching his face for any sign of doubt or reservation. I think, Daniel said slowly, as if working out the words as he spoke them, that Rachel spent the last year of her life trying to prepare me and Lily for a future without her. She made me promise to keep living, to keep my heart open to possibility, to teach our daughter that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just makes room for more love. Claire felt tears pricking her eyes again, but they were different this time. Not the salt-bitter tears of grief and fear she'd grown accustomed to, but something warmer shot through with hope she was afraid to fully embrace. I think, Daniel continued, that she would have loved you. I think she would have seen exactly what I see: someone strong enough to survive the worst kind of trauma, brave enough to keep going when giving up would have been easier, generous enough to let herself care about a widowed father and his daughter, even when caring felt like the most dangerous thing she could do. Daniel, Claire whispered, overwhelmed by the picture he was painting of her, the version of herself she desperately wanted to believe might be true. I think, he said, leaning down to rest his forehead against hers again, that 3 weeks ago we were both just surviving, just going through the motions of living, because we didn't know what else to do. And I think that now, for the first time since we lost the lives we thought we were supposed to have, we have a chance to build something new. Something that honors what we've lost while making room for what we might find. The words hung between them like a promise, like a prayer, like the first green shoots of something that might grow into something beautiful if they were brave enough to tend it properly. Claire thought about the garlic they'd planted, how it would spend months in the dark, gathering strength before pushing through the soil to reach for sunlight. Maybe that's what healing looked like, not a dramatic transformation, but a slow, patient process of putting down roots in fertile ground and trusting that spring would eventually come. Okay, she said quietly, the word carrying more weight than its 2 syllables should have been able to hold. Okay, let's try. Daniel's smile was like sunrise after a very long night. He kissed her again, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Claire felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower that had been waiting for exactly the right conditions to bloom. Later, after they'd talked until well past midnight about logistics and fears and hopes for the future, after Daniel had insisted on making up the couch for himself, because moving too fast physically was just asking for complications, neither of them was ready to handle. Claire lay in the guest bed that no longer felt temporary and listened to the quiet sounds of a house at rest. Downstairs, she could hear Daniel moving around, probably checking locks and turning off lights, in the methodical way of someone who'd learned that small rituals of safety mattered. Across the hall, Lily's breathing was even and peaceful, the sound of a child who felt secure in her world. And for the first time since her discharge from the army, Claire fell asleep without checking the exits, without cataloging potential threats, without the hypervigilance that had become as automatic as breathing. She dreamed of spring gardens and piano music, of a little girl's laughter, and a man's gentle hands of seeds planted in dark soil, and the promise of green things growing toward the light. And when she woke in the morning to the smell of coffee and pancakes, to Lily's voice calling her name with genuine joy, to the sound of Daniel humming as he worked in the kitchen, Claire felt something she'd thought was lost forever. She felt home. But peace, Claire discovered, was more fragile than she'd hoped. The morning after their conversation brought an unexpected test when her belongings arrived from North Carolina, 3 boxes and a duffel bag that contained the remnants of her military life. Daniel and Lily were out at the hardware store buying supplies for their weekend garden project, leaving Claire alone to confront the ghosts packed away in cardboard and canvas. She'd been putting off this moment for weeks, knowing that somewhere in those boxes were things she wasn't ready to face. But now, kneeling on the living room floor with a box cutter in her hands, she felt strong enough to begin the difficult work of deciding what pieces of her past she wanted to carry forward. The first box contained uniforms, boots, and medals she'd earned in another lifetime. Claire ran her fingers over the fabric that had once defined her, remembering the pride she'd felt the first time she'd put on those dress blues, the sense of purpose that had carried her through 3 deployments. These clothes belonged to Sergeant Claire Donovan, a woman who could navigate hostile territory and make life-or-death decisions without hesitation. What did you do with the physical evidence of an identity you'd lost? The second box was harder. Personal items from her barracks locker, photos of her unit, letters from fellow soldiers, a journal she'd kept during her second deployment. At the bottom, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was the bottle of sleeping pills she'd been stockpiling during those dark weeks before her discharge. The weight of them in her hands brought back the suffocating despair that had made death seem like a reasonable solution to the problem of living. Claire stared at the prescription bottle for a long moment, remembering the night she'd sat in her car in the hospital parking lot, working up the courage to swallow them all. What had stopped her wasn't hope or faith in the future, it was the simple, stubborn refusal to let the war claim one more casualty. But holding them now in this house full of warmth and possibility, she felt something different. Not the desperate urge to escape pain, but a quiet determination to choose healing instead. She was so absorbed in her memories that she didn't hear the front door open, didn't realize she wasn't alone until Lily's voice cut through her reverie like a blade. "Claire, what are those?" Claire's head snapped up to find Lily standing in the doorway, her arms full of packages from their hardware store trip. Daniel was right behind her, and Claire watched his expression change as he took in the scene, the scattered military uniforms, the photographs of soldiers, and most damning of all, the pill bottle still clutched in her hands. "They're just old things," Claire said quickly, shoving the bottle back into the box, "from my time in the army." But Lily's curious 8-year-old eyes had already cataloged the details, and her next question hit like shrapnel to the chest. "Why do you have so many pills? Are you sick?" The innocent question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, and Claire felt panic rising in her throat. How could she explain to a child who'd already lost her mother that sometimes people got so sad they wanted to stop living? How could she look at Daniel's careful, concerned expression and admit that just weeks ago she'd been planning her own death? "Their old medication," she said, finally, the words feeling like ash in her mouth, "from when I was having trouble sleeping." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either, and she could see from Daniel's expression that he understood exactly what she wasn't saying. The careful distance that had been absent from his eyes for weeks suddenly returned, and Claire felt the fragile foundation of their new beginning crack beneath her feet. "Lily, why don't you take those packages up to your room?" Daniel said quietly, his voice steady but strained. "I need to talk to Claire for a minute." "But I want to help unpack," Lily started to protest. "Now, sweetheart," Daniel said, and something in his tone made Lily's argument die in her throat. She looked between them with the perceptive awareness of a child who'd learned to read adult emotions for survival, then quietly gathered her packages and headed upstairs. The silence that followed her departure was deafening. Claire knelt frozen among the scattered remnants of her past, waiting for Daniel to ask the question she didn't know how to answer, to realize that bringing her into their home had been a mistake of catastrophic proportions. "How many?" Daniel asked, finally, his voice carefully neutral. "What?" Claire's voice came out as barely a whisper. "How many pills are in that bottle? How many were you planning to take?" The direct question hit her like a physical blow. She'd expected anger, disappointment, maybe fear for Lily's safety. She hadn't expected this clinical need for specifics, as if he were assessing a tactical situation rather than confronting the woman he'd kissed just hours ago. 60, she admitted, unable to meet his eyes. Enough to make sure it worked. Daniel was quiet for so long that Claire finally looked up, expecting to see revulsion or fear or the careful blankness people wore when they decided you were too damaged to save. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like relief. "When?" he asked. "The night before I got on the bus to Portland. I was sitting in the hospital parking lot at Fort Bragg, trying to work up the courage." The words felt like confessing war crimes, each syllable an admission of weakness she'd been trained never to reveal. "I couldn't do it. Not because I wanted to live, but because I was too stubborn to let the war take one more soldier." "Sam, I'm dead. What changed your mind?" Claire looked around the living room that had become more home to her than anywhere she'd lived since childhood, at the piano, where Lily practiced each evening, at the corner, where Daniel worked on his watches, at the photos of Rachel that smiled down from the mantelpiece, with warmth instead of accusation. "You did," she said simply. "Both of you. You reminded me what it feels like to be part of something worth living for." Daniel moved then, crossing the room in 3 quick strides and dropping to his knees beside her among the scattered boxes. His hands found her face with the same gentleness he'd shown the night before. But there was something different in his expression. Not the romantic tenderness of new love, but the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd stared into the abyss of loss and refused to let it claim another victim. "Claire," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Look at me." She met his eyes reluctantly, expecting to see pity or fear or the careful distance of someone reconsidering their choices. Instead, she saw understanding that cut straight through her defenses. "Do you know why I'm not running right now?" he asked quietly. "Why I'm not packing up Lily and putting as much distance as possible between us and someone who was planning suicide just weeks ago?" Claire shook her head, not trusting her voice. "Because 3 months after Rachel died, I stood in our garage with a rope in my hands and a plan that would have left Lily orphaned before her 6th birthday. The admission hit Claire like a physical blow, and she saw her own shock reflected in Daniel's eyes. "I'd convinced myself that she'd be better off without a father who could barely function, that my parents could raise her better than I could in my condition." "Daniel," Claire breathed, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "What stopped me wasn't hope or faith in the future. It was Lily calling for me from inside the house, needing help with something mundane and immediate. Her voice reminded me that no matter how broken I felt, she needed me to keep choosing to stay alive one day at a time." The parallel between their stories was so precise, it felt orchestrated by some cosmic force, with a twisted sense of symmetry. 2 people who'd stood at the edge of the same cliff, both saved not by grand revelations, but by the simple, stubborn refusal to abandon the people who needed them. "So when I see those pills," Daniel continued, his hands still framing her face, "I don't see weakness or instability. I see someone who fought the same battle I fought and won, someone who chose to keep going, even when going seemed impossible." "But what if I have another crisis?" Claire asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her since the previous night. "What if the depression comes back stronger, or I have a panic attack in front of Lily, or I fall apart so completely that you can't put the pieces back together?" Daniel's smile was sad but steady. "Then we'll deal with it the same way we deal with any other medical emergency. We'll get you help, we'll adjust our strategies, and we'll keep fighting until you're stable again." "It's not that simple, isn't it?" Daniel's question echoed the one he'd asked the night before, but with different weight behind it. Claire, do you think cancer was simple to deal with? Do you think watching my wife die by degrees was clean and predictable and easy to manage? The question hit her like a revelation. She'd been so focused on her own brokenness that she'd forgotten mental illness was just another kind of disease no different from the cancer that had claimed Rachel, except in the specific ways it attacked the human body. Mental health is just health, Daniel said as if reading her thoughts. Sometimes you're sick, sometimes you're well. Sometimes you need medication or therapy, or just someone to sit with you until the worst passes. But none of that changes who you are at your core any more than Rachel's cancer changed the fact that she was the most beautiful soul I've ever known. Claire felt tears streaming down her face, but for once, they weren't tears of shame or fear. They were tears of relief so profound it felt like drowning in reverse, like surfacing after being underwater so long she'd forgotten what air tasted like. "I'm scared," she whispered, the admission feeling like prayer. "Good," Daniel said, echoing his words from the night before. "Fear means you're invested in the outcome. It means you want to fight for this, for us, for the life we're trying to build together." From upstairs came the sound of Lily's door opening, followed by her voice calling down with carefully controlled casualness. "Is everything okay down there? Because I was thinking we could start working on the garden beds this afternoon, and Claire promised to help me plant the garlic." The domestic interruption was so perfectly timed, it felt like comic relief in a drama that had grown too heavy for its own good. Claire found herself laughing through her tears, overwhelmed by the simple normalcy of a child who wanted to plant vegetables and trusted that the adults in her life would work out whatever complicated emotions were keeping them from the important business of preparing for spring. "Everything's fine, sweetheart," Daniel called back, his eyes never leaving Claire's face. "We'll be up in a few minutes to change clothes." "Okay," Lily replied with satisfaction. "But don't take too long. The weather forecast says it might rain later, and we need to get the bulbs in the ground before the soil gets muddy." The practical concerns of gardening soil conditions and weather patterns, and the simple urgency of working within nature's timeline, felt like an anchor to reality after the emotional intensity of the last hour. Claire wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked around at the scattered contents of her past, feeling for the first time like she might know what to do with them. "Help me sort through these," she asked Daniel, gesturing at the boxes. They spent the next hour deciding what pieces of Sergeant Claire Donovan were worth preserving and what could be released. The medals went into a memory box that would live in the closet, significant but not defining. Most of the uniforms went to a veterans charity, but Claire kept one set for formal occasions when she needed to remember the woman she'd been. The photos of her unit went into frames for her room faces of friends who deserved to be remembered with honor rather than guilt. And the pills went down the kitchen sink, dissolved in water and washed away like the worst kind of temptation they'd always been. By the time they made it outside to work on the garden, the afternoon light was already slanting toward evening. But there was still time to plant the garlic bulbs they'd been planning, still opportunity to put something in the ground that would sleep through winter and emerge transformed in spring. Claire knelt in the soft earth beside Lily, showing her how to place each bulb, pointed end up, how to cover them with just the right amount of soil to protect without smothering. The work was meditative in the way that physical labor could be, requiring just enough attention to quiet the chattering anxiety in her head while leaving room for the deeper thoughts that needed space to unfold. "Claire," Lily's voice was thoughtful as she patted soil over a row of newly planted bulbs, "are you going to stay with us forever?" The question was asked with the casual directness that only children could manage, but Claire felt the weight of it settle over her shoulders like a mantle. Forever was a big word, the kind of promise that military training had taught her never to make because too many variables lay outside anyone's control. "I'd like to," she said, carefully choosing honesty over false reassurance. "But forever is a long time, and sometimes life changes in ways we don't expect. Like when Mommy got sick." Lily asked, her small hands still working steadily in the soil. "Like when your mommy got sick," Claire agreed. "But also like when good things happen that we weren't expecting. Like when your daddy found me at that bus stop, or when you decided I was someone worth keeping around." Lily considered this with the seriousness she brought to most adult conversations. Daddy says love isn't about promising things will never change. It's about promising to keep choosing each other even when things do change. The 8-year-old's wisdom hit Claire like a revelation. She looked across the garden bed at Daniel, who was watching their conversation with obvious pride in his daughter's insight, and something deeper in his eyes when they met Claire's, a recognition that this child was teaching them both what it meant to love without guarantees. "That's very wise," Claire said quietly. "And yes, I promise to keep choosing you and your daddy, no matter what changes come our way." "Good," Lily said with satisfaction, then brightened with mercurial childhood enthusiasm. "Now can we plant the onions? I want to see how many we can get in the ground before it gets dark." They worked until the last of the daylight faded, planting onions and garlic and the winter varieties of lettuce that would grow slowly through the cold months. By the time they finally headed inside, all three of them were muddy and tired, and filled with the particular satisfaction that came from honest work in service of future abundance. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table sharing Chinese takeout and planning the expanded garden they would plant come spring, Claire felt something settle into place inside her chest. Not peace exactly, that would take time and continued work, but the recognition that she was exactly where she belonged, with people who saw her clearly and chose to love her anyway. "I have something to tell you both," she said during a lull in the conversation, surprising herself with the decision to speak before she could lose her nerve. Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth, and Lily looked up from the elaborate fort she was building with her lo mein noodles. Both of them waited with the patient attention of people who'd learned that important announcements required space to unfold properly. "I've been thinking about what I want to do for work long term." Claire began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "The security consulting is fine for now, but it's not something I'm passionate about." "What are you passionate about?" Daniel asked gently. Claire took a breath, gathering courage. "I want to go back to school. Maybe study counseling or social work, specialize in helping other veterans transition back to civilian life." The words came out in a rush, as if speaking them quickly would make them more real. "I know it would mean student loans and years of classes and being broke for a while, but I think maybe my experiences could help other people who are struggling the way I was." The silence that followed her announcement stretched just long enough for doubt to begin creeping in. Then Lily started clapping, her face lit up with the kind of unqualified enthusiasm that only children could muster. "That's perfect," she exclaimed. "You could help other soldiers who are sad like you were, and teach them about gardening and piano and how to be part of a family." Daniel's smile was slower to develop, but no less warm. "It's a beautiful idea, Claire. Challenging, but beautiful. Have you looked into programs' requirements?" "A little," Claire admitted. "Portland State has a good social work program, and there are grants available for veterans going back to school. I'd need to take some prerequisite courses first, probably start part-time while I'm still working." "But you'd stay here?" Lily asked, her voice suddenly small with worry. "You wouldn't have to move away for school." "I'd stay here," Claire promised, reaching across the table to squeeze Lily's hand. "If you and your daddy want me to stay, this is home now." "We want you to stay," Daniel said quietly, his eyes holding hers with intensity that made her breath catch. "For as long as you'll have us, we want you to stay." Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed and they'd cleaned up the dinner dishes, Claire and Daniel found themselves back in the living room where so much had already been decided between them. But tonight felt different, less fraught with uncertainty, more grounded in the solid foundation they were building, one careful conversation at a time. "Are you sure about this?" Claire asked, settling beside Daniel on the couch with a space between them that felt comfortable rather than necessary. "About me going back to school, about the time and money and disruption it's going to cause." "Are you sure about it?" Daniel countered. Claire considered the question seriously. A week ago, she would have said no, would have listed all the reasons why someone with her history had no business trying to counsel other people through trauma. But tonight, thinking about the conversation she'd had with Dr. Martinez earlier that week, remembering the way Lily's innocent questions had helped her process emotions she'd been avoiding. She felt something that might have been certainty. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I could be good at it. Not because I have all the answers, but because I know what it feels like to lose everything that defined you and have to figure out how to keep living anyway." "Then I'm sure too," Daniel said simply. "We'll make it work. Scholarships, loans, whatever it takes. And if money gets tight, we'll adjust. Lily and I lived on a lot less before I got the watch business off the ground." The casual way he included her in their financial planning, the assumption that her goals were now their shared responsibility, hit Claire with a wave of emotion she wasn't prepared for. When was the last time someone had been willing to sacrifice for her dreams, instead of just tolerating them? "I love you," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could second-guess them. Daniel went very still beside her, and Claire felt panic rise in her throat. Too much, too soon, too presumptuous, given everything they'd already navigated today. But when he turned to face her, his expression was soft with wonder rather than concern. "I love you too," he said quietly. "I probably have since that first morning when you helped Lily with her piano and looked at our garden like it was the most beautiful thing you'd ever seen." "Really?" Claire asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Really?" Daniel confirmed, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "You want to know what convinced me?" Claire nodded, not trusting her voice. "It was watching you with Lily, but not in the way you might think. It wasn't that you were good with her, though you are. It was that you were real with her. You didn't talk down to her or try to hide your own struggles. You treated her like a complete person whose thoughts and feelings mattered." Daniel paused, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with familiar gentleness. "That's when I knew you weren't just someone passing through our lives. You were someone who could make us better, who could love us the way we needed to be loved, while letting us love you back." The words settled over Claire like a benediction, like the final piece of a puzzle she'd been trying to solve her entire adult life. She thought about the woman who'd sat at that bus stop just weeks ago, convinced she had nowhere left to go and nothing left to offer the world. That woman had been wrong about so many things. "What happens now?" she asked, leaning into his touch. "Now we keep choosing each other," Daniel said, echoing Lily's earlier wisdom. "We plant gardens and fix broken things and help a brilliant little girl grow up knowing she's loved. We figure out the logistics of school and work and building a life that honors where we've been while making room for where we're going. And if I have setbacks, if the PTSD flares up, or I struggle with depression again, then we handle it together," Daniel said with the same steady certainty he'd shown earlier. "The same way we'd handle any other challenge that came our way." Claire kissed him, then soft and sweet and full of gratitude for the man who'd seen her at her worst and chosen to love her anyway. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his and tried to memorize this moment, the weight of his arms around her, the sound of Lily's even breathing from upstairs, the sense of belonging somewhere that felt as essential as breathing. "Thank you," she whispered against his lips. "For what?" "For stopping at that bus stop. For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For reminding me that broken things can still be beautiful." Daniel's smile was soft in the lamplight. "Thank you for letting us save you, and for saving us right back." Outside, the first drops of the promised rain began to patter against the windows, but inside their small sanctuary, 3 people who'd found each other in the wreckage of loss were building something new. Something that honored the past while reaching toward a future bright with possibility, rooted in soil that would nurture growth through the darkest months until spring came again. And for the first time since her discharge from the army, Claire Donovan fell asleep. Not as a woman without a country, but as someone who'd found her way home. 6 months later, Claire stood in the same garden where she'd first learned to hope again, but now everything was transformed. The dormant beds they'd planned through winter had exploded into abundance, tomatoes heavy on their vines, herbs releasing their fragrance into the warm June air, and flowers blooming in riots of color that would have made Rachel proud. The cherry tree they'd planted in March was already showing signs of taking root, its young leaves rustling in the evening breeze like whispered promises of the blossoms that would come. The carrots are ready, Lily announced from across the garden, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd become an expert in all things agricultural over the past few months. Look how big they got. Claire looked up from the tomato plant she'd been staking, smiling at the sight of Lily carefully pulling orange carrots from the soil with the reverence of someone discovering buried treasure. At 9 years old now, Lily had grown into her role as chief garden coordinator with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else. But there was something different about her lately, a confidence and joy that seemed to radiate from some deep settled place inside her. "Save some for dinner," Daniel called from where he was working on the new greenhouse they'd built together, a structure that had started as a simple cold frame and evolved into something that would allow them to grow food year-round. "Claire's making that pasta sauce tonight, and fresh carrots will be perfect." The casual mention of dinner plans, the assumption that Claire would be cooking for them as she had almost every night for months, still sent little thrills of belonging through her chest. She'd never imagined that something as simple as meal planning could feel like the most profound expression of love. But sharing the daily responsibility of nourishing the people you cared about turned out to be its own kind of poetry. "Actually," Claire said, wiping dirt from her hands on the old gardening apron that had become her uniform, "I have something to tell you both before we go inside." The tone in her voice must have conveyed significance because both Daniel and Lily stopped what they were doing and gave her their full attention. Over the past 6 months, they'd developed an intuitive understanding of each other's rhythms, could read moods and needs in subtle shifts of posture or expression that came from living together through both ordinary days and extraordinary challenges. "Good news or complicated news?" Daniel asked, settling the hammer he'd been using and crossing to where she stood among the tomatoes. "Good news," Claire said quickly, then paused. "Well, good news, that's also a little scary." "Those are usually the best kind," Lily said sagely, unconsciously echoing the wisdom her father had shared with Claire that first night. "Like when Daddy told me we were going to plant a whole garden, even though we'd never grown anything bigger than herbs before." Claire felt her throat tighten with emotion at the child's easy acceptance of risk in service of growth, the way Lily had learned to embrace uncertainty as a natural part of building something beautiful. "I got accepted to Portland State's social work program, full funding through the VA's vocational rehabilitation program, plus a partial scholarship for academic merit." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility and change, and Claire held her breath as she watched two of the most important people in her world process what this meant for all of them. Starting graduate school would mean less time at home, more stress, financial adjustments, and the challenge of balancing academic demands with family life. But it also meant Claire was moving forward with the dream she'd shared with them months ago, was choosing to build a future instead of just surviving the present. "Claire, that's incredible." Daniel's face lit up with pride so pure and uncomplicated that Claire felt tears prick her eyes. "When do you start? What's the program like? Do you need help with anything?" "September," she said, pulling the acceptance letter from her pocket where she'd been carrying it like a talisman since it arrived that morning. 2 years for the master's degree with internships at the VA hospital and a nonprofit that works with homeless veterans. "It's going to be challenging, but I think I'm ready." "Of course you're ready," Lily said with the absolute certainty of someone who'd never doubted Claire's capabilities. "You've been helping people feel better ever since you came to live with us. Now you'll just learn the fancy words for stuff you already know how to do." The matter-of-fact assessment hit Claire with its simple truth. Over the past months, she'd found herself in an informal counseling role with other veterans in her support group, helping them navigate the transition from military to civilian life with the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd walked that path herself. She'd discovered that her experiences, even the darkest ones, had given her a kind of credibility and empathy that textbook knowledge alone couldn't provide. "There's something else," Claire said, her voice catching slightly on the words that would change everything. "I got a call from my landlord in North Carolina, the storage unit where I'd been keeping the rest of my things. He's selling the property and needs it cleared out by the end of the month." Daniel's expression shifted, understanding immediately what she wasn't quite saying. The storage unit contained the last physical ties to her old life, furniture books, photographs, and mementos from her childhood and military service that she'd been paying to keep in limbo while she figured out what her future looked like. "So you need to decide what to bring here and what to let go," he said quietly. Actually, Claire said, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared to voice the request that felt like the biggest leap of faith she'd ever taken. "I was hoping we could drive out there together, all three of us, sort through everything and bring back what's worth keeping." The words hung in the warm evening air, heavy with implication. She wasn't just asking for help with a logistical challenge. She was asking them to help her close the final chapter of her old life and fully commit to the new one they were building together. "Like a road trip?" Lily asked, her eyes lighting up with excitement. "I've never been to North Carolina. Is it far? Can we see mountains? Will we stay in hotels?" Daniel's smile was soft as he watched his daughter's enthusiasm, but when his eyes met Claire's, she saw understanding of the deeper significance of what she was proposing. This wasn't just about retrieving belongings. It was about choosing to let the past inform the future instead of defining it, about trusting that the life they'd built was strong enough to withstand the weight of everything she'd been before. "When would we go?" he asked practically. "Next week, if that works for you. I can take time off from the consulting job, and it would give us a chance to—" Claire paused, searching for words to express what she couldn't quite articulate. "I want you to see where I came from. I want to introduce you to the parts of my past that are worth preserving and say goodbye to the parts that aren't." "Yes," Daniel said simply, and the certainty in his voice made Claire's chest flood with warmth. "Of course we'll go with you." "This is going to be the best adventure ever," Lily declared, already spinning elaborate plans in her head. "We can take pictures and buy postcards, and I can write a report about it for school when classes start again." The easy acceptance, the way both Daniel and Lily embraced this next step in their journey together without hesitation or doubt, reminded Claire once again how profoundly her life had changed. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined trusting anyone enough to invite them into her past. Now the idea of making this pilgrimage alone felt unthinkable. They spent the rest of the evening planning the trip while preparing dinner together in the kitchen that had become the heart of their home. Claire chopped vegetables from their garden while Daniel handled the pasta, and Lily set the table with the careful precision of someone who took her responsibilities seriously. The easy choreography of shared domestic life, the way they moved around each other without needing to negotiate space or roles, felt like the most sophisticated dance Claire had ever learned. "Can I ask you something?" Lily said as they sat down to eat her fork, pausing over the plate of pasta primavera that showcased their garden's bounty. "When we go to North Carolina, are you going to be sad about the things we leave behind?" The question was asked with the gentle directness that had become Lily's trademark. But Claire could hear the deeper concern underneath worry that this journey into Claire's past might somehow diminish her commitment to their present. "Probably," Claire said honestly, setting down her own fork to give the question the attention it deserved. "Some of those things have been with me for a long time, and saying goodbye is always hard, even when you know it's the right thing to do. Like when we gave away some of Mommy's clothes," Lily said thoughtfully. "It was sad, but also good because other people could use them, and we kept the special ones that made us think of her best memories." Daniel's eyes met Claire's across the table, both of them struck once again by their daughter's emotional intelligence and her ability to find wisdom in her own experiences with loss and letting go. "Exactly like that," Claire agreed. "We'll keep the things that tell good stories and help us remember who I was in a happy way, and we'll let go of the things that only remind me of sad times. And then when we come home, you'll have all your important stuff here where it belongs," Lily said with satisfaction. "And our house will be even more like a real family house." The phrase "real family house" hit Claire like a gentle punch to the solar plexus. Over the past months, she'd gradually moved her belongings from the guest room into Daniel's room, had claimed spaces throughout the house for her books and clothes, and the small rituals that made a place feel like home. But hearing Lily articulate what they'd all been feeling, that this transition from temporary house guest to permanent family member was almost complete, made something inside Claire's chest settle into place with an almost audible click. Speaking of family, Daniel said, his voice careful in the way that meant he was about to say something important. There's something I've been wanting to discuss with both of you. Both Claire and Lily looked at him expectantly, and Claire felt a flutter of nerves at his serious tone. Over the past months, their major conversations had usually brought good news decisions about the garden plans for home improvements, celebrations of Claire's progress in therapy, or Lily's achievements in school. But something in Daniel's expression suggested this was different, weightier. I know we've talked about the future in general terms. He began, his eyes moving between Claire and Lily, about school and careers and the garden and all the practical things we're building together. But I think it's time we talked about making it official. Claire's heart stuttered to a stop, then began racing so fast she was sure they could hear it across the table. Official how? She managed to ask. Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his face with a tenderness that made Claire's breath catch. I want to marry you, Claire. I want to adopt you into our family in every legal and spiritual way possible. I want to promise in front of everyone we care about that we're choosing each other for keeps. The words hung in the evening air like a benediction, like an answer to prayers Claire hadn't dared to pray. She stared at Daniel's face, searching for any sign of doubt or uncertainty, but found only the steady certainty that had drawn her to him from the beginning. But more than that, Daniel continued, reaching across the table to take her hand. I want Lily to have the security of knowing that you're not just living with us, you're part of us. That even if something happens to me, you'll still be her family. Claire's eyes filled with tears as the full meaning of his proposal hit her. This wasn't just about romantic love, though that was certainly part of it. This was about creating legal and emotional bonds that would protect all of them, that would give Lily the security of knowing her family was permanent and unshakable. What do you think, Lily? Claire asked, her voice rough with emotion. How would you feel about that? Lily's response was immediate and enthusiastic. I think it's perfect. I've been hoping you'd get married ever since that night when you helped me with piano, and Daddy looked at you like you were made of sunshine. The poetic description made both adults laugh through their tears, and Claire felt the last of her carefully constructed defenses crumble completely. For months, she'd been afraid to hope for this level of permanence, had told herself that being grateful for what she had was enough. But sitting here in the kitchen that smelled like fresh herbs and shared laughter, surrounded by people who loved her exactly as she was, Claire realized that settling for enough had been another form of self-protection she no longer needed. Yes, she said simply, her voice clear and strong despite the tears streaming down her face. Yes to all of it. Yes to marriage and family and building something that lasts. Yes to choosing each other for keeps. Daniel's smile was incandescent as he brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a seal on the promise they were making. I don't have a ring yet, he admitted. I wanted to make sure you said yes before I started shopping. I don't need a ring to know this is real, Claire said, though she was already imagining how it would feel to wear Daniel's ring, to have that visible symbol of belonging that she'd never thought she wanted. But when you do pick one out, I'd like Lily to help. This is her decision too. Really? Lily's eyes went wide with delight. I get to help pick out your engagement ring. That's like the most important job ever. The most important job ever, Claire agreed, reaching out to include Lily in the embrace she was sharing with Daniel. Because you're going to be my daughter too, and daughters should definitely have opinions about their mother's jewelry. The word mother slipped out before Claire could second guess it. But instead of panic, she felt only rightness. She would never replace Rachel in Lily's heart, would never want to, but there was room in this child's life for multiple sources of maternal love and guidance. I'd like that, Lily said softly, her voice carrying a weight of emotion that reminded Claire once again how much depth existed behind the child's cheerful exterior. Having a mom again, I mean. It's been just me and Daddy for so long, and he's really good at most stuff, but he doesn't know anything about braiding hair or picking out clothes or what it feels like to be a girl sometimes. Daniel laughed, ruffling his daughter's hair with obvious affection. Guilty as charged. I've been winging it on the girl stuff for 3 years now. You've done an amazing job, Claire said firmly, meaning every word. Lily is incredible, and that's because you've loved her so well. I'm not here to fix anything that's broken. I'm here to add to what's already beautiful. The conversation that followed was practical and dreamy in equal measure, touching on everything from wedding plans to living arrangements to the logistics of Claire officially adopting Lily after the marriage was finalized. They talked about having the ceremony in the garden they'd built together, about inviting Claire's therapy group, and the few family members who'd stayed in touch about making it a celebration that honored both their journey together and the people they'd lost along the way. We should plant something special, Lily suggested as they finally began clearing the dinner dishes. Like a tree or a bush that will bloom every year on our anniversary, so we can remember this feeling forever. What kind of tree? Daniel asked, indulging his daughter's romantic imagination. Something that smells really good and has pretty flowers, Lily said decisively. And something that gets bigger every year like our family will if we decide to have more kids someday. Claire felt her breath catch at the casual mention of future children, a possibility she'd trained herself not to consider during the years when she couldn't imagine having anything stable enough to offer a child. But now, surrounded by evidence of what she and Daniel could build together, the idea didn't seem impossible. Maybe a lilac bush, she suggested quietly. They bloom in late spring, and the smell is incredible. Plus, they're hardy enough to survive anything winter throws at them. Perfect, Daniel agreed, his eyes holding hers with understanding of the metaphor she was offering. Something beautiful that comes back stronger every year. What? As they worked together to clean the kitchen, Claire found herself memorizing the moment the golden lights slanting through windows that looked out on their garden. The easy rhythm of shared tasks, the sense of completeness that came from knowing exactly where she belonged in the world. 6 months ago, she'd been sitting at a bus stop with nowhere to go and no reason to hope for anything better. Now she was planning a wedding and thinking about children and choosing plants that would bloom for decades to come. Later that evening, after Lily had gone to bed and they'd settled into their usual routine of reading and gentle conversation, Daniel pulled out his phone and showed Claire something that made her heart skip a beat. I lied earlier, he said with a sheepish smile, about not having a ring picked out. I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment to ask. The ring was perfect, simple and elegant, with a diamond that caught the lamplight and threw tiny rainbows across the ceiling. But more than its beauty, Claire was struck by the fact that Daniel had been planning this proposal for weeks, had been carrying this symbol of commitment and hope, while she worried about whether she was presuming too much by imagining a permanent future with them. It's beautiful, she whispered as he slipped it onto her finger, marveling at how right it felt to see it there. When did you know? When did you decide you wanted to marry me? Daniel was quiet for a moment, his thumb tracing circles over the ring he'd just placed on her hand. The night you told us about the pills, he said finally. When I realized that you'd been planning to die just weeks before you found us, and that our love had been strong enough to call you back to life. That's when I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life making sure you never felt that lost again. The confession hit Claire like a physical blow, but it was the good kind of pain, the kind that came from being seen and loved so completely that pretense became impossible. And when did you know you loved me? Daniel asked gently. Claire didn't have to think about her answer. The first morning when you made pancakes and didn't ask me any questions about where I'd come from or what I was running from. When you just let me exist in your space without earning it or proving I deserved it. That early, Daniel sounded surprised. That early, Claire confirmed. Not romantic love that took longer, but the kind of love that recognizes home when it finds it. That was immediate. They talked until well past midnight, making plans and sharing dreams, and marveling at the strange alchemy that had transformed 3 broken people into something that felt unbreakable. When they finally headed upstairs, Claire paused at Lily's door, looking in on the child who would soon legally be her daughter. She's going to be okay, Daniel said softly, following her gaze. better than okay. She's going to grow up knowing that families can be created through choice and commitment, not just biology. That's a gift that will serve her well her whole life. I hope so, Claire said, overwhelmed by the responsibility and privilege of helping to shape this remarkable child's future. I want to be worthy of what you're both offering me. You already are, Daniel said with quiet certainty. You've been worthy since the moment you chose to get in our car, instead of waiting for a bus that was never coming. The next week passed in a blur of preparation for their trip to North Carolina. Claire found herself alternately excited and nervous about the journey, eager to show Daniel and Lily where she'd come from, while simultaneously worried about what painful memories the trip might dredge up. But as they loaded the car on a warm Thursday morning, she felt more anticipation than dread. The drive east took 2 days, with an overnight stop in a hotel that Lily declared the fanciest place she'd ever stayed, despite it being a perfectly ordinary roadside motel. But watching her excitement over the ice machine and the pool that was barely big enough for swimming laps, Claire was reminded once again how much joy could be found in simple adventures when you were sharing them with people you loved. They reached the storage facility in Fayetteville on Friday afternoon, and Claire felt her chest tighten as they pulled up to the familiar building where she'd hastily stashed the remnants of her old life during those dark weeks after her discharge. The unit contained everything she'd owned that couldn't fit in a duffel bag. Furniture from her off-base apartment, boxes of books and photographs, military awards and mementos, and the detritus of a life that had ended abruptly with no time for careful curation. It's bigger than I expected, Daniel said, as they stood before the roll-up door that had been holding Claire's past in suspended animation for almost a year. I had a lot of stuff, Claire admitted, fitting the key into the lock with hands that trembled slightly. A whole apartment's worth of things that seemed important at the time. When the door rolled up, revealing the neat rows of boxes and furniture she'd packed with military precision, Claire felt a wave of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. Here was the physical evidence of Sergeant Claire Donovan's life, the woman who'd served 3 tours, who'd believed her purpose was found in following orders and completing missions, who'd never imagined that the most important battle of her life would be learning how to be loved. Where do we start? Lily asked, her voice hushed with the reverence of someone entering a museum dedicated to a person she cared about. Let's start with the easy stuff, Claire said, pointing to a box marked kitchen. Things that are useful but not emotional. They worked methodically through the storage unit, sorting items into 3 categories: keep, donate, and discard. Most of the furniture went into the donate pile. Claire's new life had no need for the bachelor pad aesthetic she'd cultivated during her military years. But some things were worth preserving. The dining room table her grandmother had left her a bookshelf Daniel admired for its craftsmanship, and a cedar chest that had belonged to her mother. The harder decisions came with the boxes of personal items, military awards and commendations that represented years of service, but also painful memories. Photographs of fellow soldiers, some of whom had made it home, and some of whom hadn't. Letters from her parents written before their deaths that she'd read so many times, the paper was soft with handling. "Tell me about this one," Lily said, holding up a photograph of Claire in dress uniform at what appeared to be a formal military ceremony. "That was my promotion to sergeant," Claire said, taking the photo and studying her younger self's face. "I was so proud that day. I felt like I'd finally found my place in the world." "You look happy," Daniel observed, looking over her shoulder. "Different from how you looked that first night at the bus stop, but happy." "I was happy," Claire agreed. "That version of me had a clear sense of purpose and identity. Losing that was part of what made the transition so hard." "But you found a new purpose," Lily pointed out with her characteristic insight. "Helping other people find their families like you found ours." The simple statement reframed everything Claire had been thinking about her journey from soldier to civilian to family member. She hadn't lost her sense of purpose, she'd evolved it. The woman who'd served her country with honor and the woman who was about to start graduate school to help other veterans were the same person, just applied to different missions. They kept the photograph along with several others that captured Claire at her best and strongest. They kept the letters from her parents and the medals that represented genuine achievement rather than just time served. They kept her grandmother's jewelry and her mother's recipes and the books that had sustained her through difficult deployments. What they left behind was equally important. The prescription bottles from her darkest days, the clothing that reminded her of hospitals and discharge proceedings, the mementos from relationships that had ended badly or friendships that had been casualties of her mental health struggles, the physical manifestations of pain and trauma that had defined too much of her recent past. "I think that's everything worth keeping," Claire said as they loaded the last box into their rented trailer. The storage unit was nearly empty now, containing only items destined for donation pickup the following day. "How do you feel?" Daniel asked, wrapping his arms around her as they stood looking at the empty space that had once contained her entire life. "Free," Claire said, after thinking about it for a moment. "Like I finally finished a deployment that lasted way too long." They drove home slowly, taking scenic routes through the Blue Ridge Mountains that gave them opportunities to stop and explore, to create new memories that had nothing to do with Claire's past and everything to do with their shared future. Lily collected postcards and pressed flowers, determined to document every mile of their first family road trip. On Sunday evening, as they pulled into their driveway in Portland, Claire felt the same sense of homecoming she'd experienced that first night when Daniel had brought her into his house out of the rain. But this time it was deeper, more complete. She wasn't a stranger seeking shelter. She was a woman returning home with the people she loved, carrying carefully chosen pieces of her past to integrate into the life they were building together. 3 weeks later, on a perfect Saturday in August, when the garden was at its peak, Glory Claire Donovan became Claire Hayes in a ceremony that was everything they'd dreamed it would be. The wedding was small and intimate, held in the backyard they'd transformed together with an officiant who understood that this wasn't just a marriage, but the formal recognition of a family that had been growing organically for months. Lily served as both maid of honor and ring bearer, wearing a dress the exact shade of lavender as the bush they'd planted beside the greenhouse to mark their engagement. Dr. Martinez was there, along with several members of Claire's veteran support group who'd become like family over the past year. Daniel's parents flew in from Seattle and his sister drove down from Vancouver with her kids, all of them embracing Claire with the warmth of people who understood she'd brought their son back to life. But the moment that mattered most came during the exchange of vows, when Claire looked into Daniel's eyes and spoke words she'd written after much consideration and many tears. "Daniel," she said, her voice clear and strong, despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. "6 months ago, I was a woman without a country, without a purpose, without hope for anything beyond simply surviving until the next day. You saw me at my worst and chose to love me anyway. You gave me a home when I was homeless, a family when I was alone, and most importantly, you gave me back my belief that I was worth saving." She paused, looking out at the garden that surrounded them, tomatoes and herbs and flowers blooming in abundance, the cherry tree they'd planted showing signs of healthy growth, the lilac bush that would bloom on future anniversaries. "I promised to tend this love like we tend this garden, with patience and consistency and faith that beautiful things can grow even after the hardest winters. I promise to choose you and Lily every day in good times and difficult ones, for as long as I'm privileged to call you my family." Daniel's vows were equally emotional, speaking of second chances and the courage to love again after loss, of the way Claire had brought laughter and music back into their home and taught them both that families could be created through intention as much as biology. But it was Lily who surprised everyone when the officiant asked if anyone had words to add to the ceremony. The 9-year-old stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd clearly been planning this moment. "I just want to say," she announced to the small gathering, "that I think Mommy would be really happy about today. She always said that love was like gardening. If you took good care of it and gave it what it needed, it would grow bigger than you ever imagined. And that's what happened with our family. We planted love and took care of it, and now it's big enough for all of us." There wasn't a dry eye in the garden as Lily concluded her impromptu speech, and Claire felt her heart expand so much it seemed impossible her chest could contain it. This child who'd lost her mother too young and had every right to be jealous or resentful of the woman taking on that role had instead become the architect of their family's healing. The reception that followed was joyful chaos, dancing to music played through speakers set up in the garden, toasts that made everyone laugh and cry in equal measure, and enough food to feed twice their number of guests. But as evening fell and the last guest departed, Claire found herself standing in the kitchen with her new husband and daughter washing dishes and marveling at how perfectly ordinary and extraordinarily meaningful it all felt. "So, what happens now?" Lily asked as they finished putting away the last of the wedding presents, echoing the question Claire had asked Daniel that first night when they'd admitted their feelings for each other. "Now we keep doing what we've been doing," Daniel said, pulling both his wife and daughter into an embrace that felt like coming full circle. "We love each other and take care of our garden and figure out each day as it comes. And I start school in 2 weeks," Claire added, still hardly believing that particular dream was about to become reality. "And in 2 years, I'll graduate and start helping other people find their way home the way you both helped me find mine. And maybe by then, we'll be ready to add a baby to our family," Lily said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "Because this house has room for more love, and I think I'd be a really good big sister." Claire felt Daniel's arms tighten around them both, felt his laughter rumble through his chest, and knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. A woman who'd once been without a country had found her homeland in the arms of a widowed father and his remarkable daughter. A man who'd thought his heart was too damaged for new love had discovered that the right person could help you heal while loving them back to wholeness. And a little girl who'd lost her mother too soon had gained not just a stepmother, but living proof that families could be rebuilt stronger than before. That love didn't diminish when shared, but multiplied beyond measure. As they stood together in their kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life they'd built from broken pieces, Claire thought about destiny and choice, about the random chances that had led her to that bus stop on a rainy November night. She thought about the cherry tree growing in their backyard, how it would bloom for decades to come, marking the seasons of their love with promises of renewal and growth. But mostly, she thought about home, not as a place you were born to, but as something you chose to build with the people brave enough to love you exactly as you are, broken pieces and all. And she knew, with the certainty that came from hard-won wisdom, that she was exactly where she belonged. In the garden beyond their kitchen window, the lilac bush they'd planted on their engagement stood ready for its first winter gathering strength for the blooms that would come with spring. Like their love, like their family, like the hope that had carried them all through the darkest nights into this moment of perfect ordinary joy. They were home, they were whole, they were enough, and they were just beginning.